The evening had fallen quiet, though the wind still wandered the edges of the settlement like a restless ghost. Snow clung in thin patches where the sun had failed to burn it away, mixing with dust that rose in pale swirls across the wagon tracks. The world seemed brittle, fragile, as though the land itself held its breath. Along that worn track walked a small figure, only 7 years old, barefoot against the frozen earth. Her dress was torn at the hem, her small shoulders hidden beneath a fraying shawl too thin for the season. Yet her steps did not falter. Each one was driven by something greater than fear, though her face told of both, fear and the stubborn courage of a child who had seen too much already. She did not cry, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She knew where she must go. Somewhere beyond the dim line of cabins was a man she had seen once before, riding tall upon a horse, his shadow long in the dusk. He had looked like someone who could not be bent, someone the wind itself might hesitate to push. And now, with her mother lying broken in the shadows of a cabin too cruel to call home, he was the only one who came to her mind. Her breath steamed in front of her lips as she hurried on. The town was half asleep, lanterns glowing through cracked shutters, dogs barking in the distance. She ignored the stares of men sitting outside the saloon, their laughter sharp as knives. She ignored the questions that rose in her chest. Would he listen? Would he care? Would he leave her to the same silence that had already stolen so much? Her little fingers clenched into fists at her sides as she whispered to herself that she could not fail. Her mother's life was worth more than her trembling. He appeared as if pulled from the very thought of him. A lone rider just beyond the edge of town, his horse's hooves stirring the earth, his coat dust-stained, his hat pulled low. When his eyes caught hers, the child stopped. For a moment the world seemed to narrow to nothing but that gaze. He was 30, hardened by miles of open trail, his face carrying lines carved by both sun and sorrow. Yet beneath that weathered surface there lingered something steadier than stone. He slowed his horse, studying her as if trying to understand why a little girl would stand barefoot in the cold, staring at him as though he was the last star in the night sky. She did not beg. She stepped forward, tugged lightly at the leather strap on his saddle, her small hand trembling yet firm. Her voice was thin but resolute when she spoke. Come save her. Only those 3 words. She did not need to explain. Her eyes carried the rest, the bruises on her mother's face, the blows that had rained down from hands meant to protect, the silence of neighbors who pretended not to see. The cowboy looked down at her, and something shifted inside him. He had told himself many times that he was only a man passing through, that he could not afford to gather the burdens of others. His past had been carved deep enough. His heart was already a graveyard of promises lost to dust. But there was a fire in that little girl's gaze, a desperate courage that demanded to be met. It was not a plea. It was a command delivered by innocence, and he could not turn away from it. He swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the frozen soil. His revolver caught the lantern glow, a reminder of the weight he carried, but he let his hand fall away from it. He knelt so that his eyes were level with hers. For a long breath, they simply looked at one another, man and child, both bound by the same truth. Someone needed saving, and there was no one else who would come. He gave a single nod, the kind of promise a man makes without words, and reached for the reins. Together they walked toward the edge of the settlement, her small steps quickened by his longer stride. The lanterns behind them grew faint, the world narrowing into silence, broken only by the crunch of their feet. Each step felt like entering deeper into a story neither had asked for, but both were already inside. She pointed the way, her hand still clutching his coat as if to keep him tethered to her resolve. The cabin came into sight, a sagging structure leaning into the wind, its roof patched with old boards, its windows dark. The smell of damp wood and smoke hung heavy even before they reached the door. The child's hand trembled harder now, yet she did not release his coat. She whispered only once, her voice cracking like brittle twigs. "She's in there." He studied the cabin, the faint shift of shadows through the cracks, the weight of cruelty that seemed to breathe from its walls. His jaw tightened. He was no stranger to the kind of darkness that hid behind closed doors, the kind men turned away from to spare themselves the sight. But here was a child who refused to turn away. With a quiet breath, he pushed the door open. Light from his lantern spilled across the floor, cutting through the gloom. What he saw made his chest tighten. A young woman, not much older than 20, lying crumpled in the corner. Her face bore bruises, her arms mottled with pain. She had been left as though her life meant less than broken wood. The little girl rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her mother, whispering words too soft to hear. The cowboy stepped inside slowly, lantern high, his eyes never leaving the broken figure on the floor. Something inside him, long buried beneath dust and silence, stirred like an ember touched by breath. The parents lurked at the edges of the room, muttering, dismissing, excusing their cruelty. Their eyes dared him to leave, dared him to treat her life as they had. But he did not answer them. He knelt beside the woman, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his rough hand unexpectedly gentle. He listened to her faint, rattled breath and felt the fire in his chest grow stronger. He looked at the girl, then at her mother, and finally at the shadows who had caused this. His silence said what words could not. He would not leave her to this fate. His decision was already made. He rose, steady as a mountain, and with that simple act the air inside the cabin shifted, as though the very walls knew the balance of power had changed. And when he turned back toward the door, lantern leading the way, both child and mother became more than strangers he had stumbled upon. They became the weight he chose to carry. The night swallowed them as they stepped out into the cold, lantern glow flickering like a fragile promise against the vast, waiting dark. The door closed behind them with a thud that seemed to carry the weight of finality, yet the echo lingered, as though the cabin itself resented the loss of control. Outside, the air was cold, but not as cruel as what had been left behind. The lantern swung from the cowboy's hand, its light stretching across the frost, casting tall shadows of the three who walked together, one limping, one stumbling small, and one steady as a post driven into the earth. He lifted the young woman into his arms without strain, though her body was fragile, as if the life within her might slip away with a careless touch. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow and uneven. He could feel the tremor of pain ripple through her, yet she did not cry out. Perhaps she had spent her tears long ago. The child walked close to his side, one hand gripping his coat hem, refusing to let him drift even an inch away from her fragile world of trust. From the doorway of that cursed cabin, her parents stood, their figures bent and bitter in the pale glow. Their words followed like poison on the wind. She brought this upon herself. She never learned. She is nothing but trouble. Each word was a stone thrown toward their daughter, an attempt to bury her deeper. The cowboy did not answer. He did not waste his voice on those who mistook cruelty for strength. His silence was sharp enough. He walked on. The town offered no welcome as he passed through its edge. A dog barked, shutters creaked, and somewhere a man spat into the dirt, muttering about meddling in another family's affairs. Still he walked, boots crunching through frost and gravel, the rhythm of his stride as steady as the heart beating beneath the woman's ear. She stirred once, whispering a sound that might have been apology, or maybe only a broken fragment of breath. He hushed her softly, not with words, but with the warmth of a hand adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. At last the cabin appeared, a lone shape against the slope of a hill, where the land leaned away from the town's noise. Its roof sagged slightly, its chimney worn, yet smoke rose thin and constant, a sign of life. He pushed open the door with his boot, stepped into the dim room, and set her gently on a cot covered in rough wool. The little girl climbed beside her, pressing a cheek against her mother's arm, whispering promises no one else could hear. The cowboy moved with quiet purpose, setting the lantern on the table, reaching for a jar of salve, strips of cloth, a pitcher of water. His hands were rough, scarred by years of rope and reins, yet when they touched her wounds they were careful, as though each bruise might crumble under his fingers. He worked without chatter, his silence becoming its own kind of language. The girl watched with wide eyes, her trust widening into awe as she saw someone tend to her mother with the gentleness she herself had tried to offer in secret. For the woman, each touch was both pain and mercy. Her breaths caught, her eyelids fluttered, and now and then she opened her eyes to glimpse his face. A stranger's face, hard-lined and shadowed by loss, yet patient, almost reverent. In her weakened state she could not speak, but her silence spoke enough. She had never known care without cost, never known strength that did not demand surrender. He finished binding her ribs, brushing away strands of hair that clung damp to her temples. Then he sat back, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze lowered to the floorboards as though wrestling with a storm inside. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he would keep them here only until she could stand, until the girl's small shoulders no longer shook in the night. He had walked too many roads alone to believe he could bear another's burdens for long. Yet when he glanced up and found the child staring at him, clutching her mother's hand with fierce devotion, the lie in his own thoughts became clear. Some burdens are not chosen, they are given, and to refuse them would be to deny the very core of what it means to be human. Through the thin walls came the hush of the wind, a whistle of winter still clinging to the land. In that silence, the girl asked the first question she had spoken since leaving her home. "You won't leave us, will you?" Her voice was soft, but it carried the full weight of her heart. He did not answer right away. He looked at her, then at her mother, then at the flames licking inside the hearth. When at last he spoke, his voice was low, steady, almost reluctant. "Not tonight. Rest now." The girl accepted those words as enough, though in her eyes shone the hope of a promise larger than he was willing to give. She leaned against her mother, humming a tune that trembled on the edges of sleep. The woman's eyelids drifted shut, exhaustion claiming her at last. The cowboy sat watch, his shadow stretching long against the wall, his revolver close at hand, though the danger now came not from wolves or outlaws, but from people who should have been family. He remained there until the fire burned low, listening to their breathing, measuring it against the steady beat of his own. Every so often he glanced toward the door, imagining the figures who might stand there one day demanding to take her back. His jaw tightened, his hand brushing the grip of his gun. Yet for now, the night held its peace. For now, the only sound was the soft hum of a child and the fragile breath of a woman clinging to life. When the first faint streaks of dawn pressed against the shutters, he rose and added wood to the fire, careful not to wake them. He stepped outside, letting the cold bite his skin, and watched the horizon blush with the slow light of morning. His breath rose in steady clouds, and he knew the weight he had chosen, or perhaps the weight that had chosen him, was only beginning. The days unfolded slowly, each one marked by the rhythm of small labors and the quiet weight of recovery. Snow gave way to rain, and the thaw brought with it the damp smell of earth waking after long silence. The cabin became its own fragile world, a place where time stretched thin and where the smallest gestures took on the weight of salvation. The young woman rested often, her body still marked by bruises that refused to fade, yet strength crept back into her like water into dry ground. She could sit upright now, sometimes even stand with the help of her daughter's steadying hand. The girl never strayed far, humming tunes while folding cloths or setting pieces of wood in the hearth, her devotion so constant it seemed she feared even the passing of minutes without watch. The cowboy spoke little, but his silence carried meaning. He rose with the dawn, splitting logs, mending fences, patching the roof where rain leaked through. His boots moved across the porch in steady patterns, his hands calloused yet deliberate as he gave shape to order in a place that had long known only neglect. Sometimes the girl would follow him, asking how to strike a match without burning her fingers, or how to knot twine so it would not slip loose. He answered without indulgence, simply showing, then letting her try. When she managed the task, her grin flared bright enough to warm even the dimmest morning. For the mother, it was stranger still to feel the weight of another's presence without the sting of scorn. She watched him with wary eyes at first, expecting demand or debt to follow his kindness, but none came. He left food by her side before sunrise, set water within reach, and then went about his tasks without fuss. When she tried to thank him, her voice raw from both pain and disbelief, he only shook his head and returned to his work. Gratitude seemed unnecessary to a man who measured his worth not by words received, but by the steadiness of his own actions. Yet the quiet peace inside those walls was not left untroubled. Rumors began to drift in from the town like cold wind slipping through cracks. At the saloon, men muttered that she had been taken from her parents' home, that the stranger kept her hidden, that he had no right to interfere. Pride stung those who had cast her aside, for cruelty, once seen by others, often turns to rage when it meets resistance. The cowboy heard these whispers when he stopped for supplies, the sneers curling from mouths that feared nothing more than a man who refused to bend. He left without answering, but his jaw was tight, his eyes darker than before. Inside the cabin, the woman sensed it too, the shadow of those who still wished to claim power over her, who could not bear the thought of her healing without their permission. At night she lay awake, listening to the rain beat on the roof, wondering how long safety could truly last. Her daughter sometimes stirred beside her, whispering questions half asleep. Will he stay? Will they find us? Will we ever be free? She could not answer, so she only brushed hair from the child's brow and prayed her silence would not betray her fear. One evening, while the storm poured heavy outside, the three of them sat near the fire. The girl had fallen asleep curled against her mother, her breath soft, her small hand still gripping fabric as if afraid to release her hold. The woman looked across the room to where the cowboy sat, oiling the wood of his revolver with slow, practiced motions. His face was calm, yet beneath that calm was something unspoken, a vigilance that never left him. She found her voice then, thin but clear. "Why did you help us?" The question lingered in the air, almost fragile, as though she feared the answer might shatter the fragile bond that had begun to form. He did not look up right away. The firelight caught the lines of his face, shadows deepening the weariness etched there. At last he set the revolver aside, folded his hands, and spoke with a voice low and even. "Because I couldn't walk away from a child's voice calling in the dark. Nothing more, nothing less." His words struck deeper than he knew. She stared at him, her throat tightening. No man in her life had ever seen her as more than a burden. No man had ever looked at her pain without using it against her. Yet here was someone who had not demanded, not judged, not weighed her worth against what she could give. The quiet reverence of that truth filled the room more than any sermon could. The fire snapped, sending sparks upward. She wanted to tell him she was afraid, that the whispers from town would grow into something worse, that those who had broken her once would try again. But she could not bring herself to say it aloud. Instead, she let silence hang, and in that silence she read his resolve more clearly than words could ever express. He already knew the danger. He had already chosen where he would stand. When the storm at last eased and the night grew still, a strange peace settled over the cabin. The girl stirred, half awake, and let out a small laugh at some dream she carried. The sound, soft and fleeting, lit the room brighter than the fire itself. For the first time, the woman allowed herself to smile, the corners of her lips trembling with both wonder and fear of what it meant to feel alive again. Across the room, the cowboy caught that fleeting smile and let it linger in his memory. He did not return it fully, but something softened in his eyes. The night ended on that fragile note of warmth, yet beyond the cabin walls the land held its own restless silence. Trouble was stirring, pride and cruelty gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. But for one evening, in the glow of a dying fire, the three of them sat inside a circle of belonging they had carved out of brokenness. The peace was delicate, like glass in the palm of a hand, and all three knew it could shatter. Still, it was theirs, and for that night it was enough. The night was heavy with stormlight, the sky split by sudden flashes that turned the hills pale and strange. Rain came hard, beating against the cabin roof as if it meant to wash the world clean. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing its glow across faces that had known too much weariness and yet had found a fragile rest. The little girl lay curled beneath a quilt, her breath steady at last. Her mother watched her, eyes tired but clearer than they had been in weeks. Across the room the cowboy sat, back straight, revolver resting on the table within reach. He listened more than he slept, the kind of man who measured danger by silence as much as sound. When the first knock came, it was not the timid tap of neighborly courtesy, but the heavy pound of claim and demand. The mother stiffened, her hand flying to her daughter's shoulder. The cowboy's gaze shifted to the door, calm though his jaw tightened. Another blow came, then a voice, rough and sharp, cutting through the storm. "Bring her out. She belongs to us." The words carried pride, not love, the same pride that had left her broken in the dust. Behind them more voices stirred, laughter soaked in liquor, threats tangled with old bitterness. They had not come to ask, they had come to take. The cowboy rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He motioned for the woman to stay back, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "Keep the girl close." The woman nodded, pulling her daughter into her arms, her body trembling not just with fear but with fury at the thought of losing what little safety she had found. The cowboy stepped to the door, every movement measured, as though each second carried the weight of a lifetime. When he opened it, rain swept inside, lantern light spilling out to reveal the shapes of men hunched against the storm. At their center stood the parents, faces twisted with a blend of anger and wounded pride. They spat accusations, claiming he had stolen what was theirs, that he had no right to shelter her. He did not flinch. His voice was steady, almost quiet, yet it carried over the storm. "She is not yours to break again. She is not yours at all." The words struck like a shot, and for a moment the men faltered. But cruelty rarely surrenders so easily. One stepped forward, hand on a rusted knife. Another lifted a club. The father snarled, ordering them to drag her out, to teach the stranger a lesson. The cowboy's hand moved to his revolver, not lifted yet, but resting there as if the weapon itself was listening. His eyes stayed fixed on the men, unblinking, unshaken. "Go back now. You'll get no victory here." The storm answered with a crack of thunder, and in its wake came the rush of movement. One man lunged, mud spraying beneath his boots. The revolver cleared leather in a blur, and the gunfire split the night, echoing across the hills like the voice of judgment. The man staggered back, his knife clattering into the dirt. The others froze, the sudden truth of steel and resolve holding them where words had failed. The cowboy did not fire again. He did not need to. His stance, firm in the doorway with rain running off his hat brim, spoke louder than a hail of bullets. Inside, the child pressed her face into her mother's dress, but her small eyes peeked out, watching not with terror but with a strange, fierce knowledge that he would not let them be taken. The mother's heart pounded, her hands tightening around her daughter, yet beneath the fear there was something new, an unshakable sense that they were no longer alone. The men outside muttered, shifting uneasily. Pride urged them forward, but fear held them still. At last the mother's father spat into the mud, his words bitter with defeat. "She'll crawl back when he grows tired of her." Then he turned, pulling the others with him into the storm. Their shapes faded into the darkness, their threats carried away by the rain. The cowboy remained standing in the doorway, revolver still in hand, until the last shadow was gone. Only then did he lower it, sliding the weapon back into its holster with the care of a man who understood the weight of violence. He lingered there a moment longer, letting the rain wash over him, before closing the door and returning to the quiet glow of the fire. The woman's eyes found his as he stepped inside, her face pale but lit with something fierce, something free. She tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. He shook his head gently, his voice low, steady, carrying more truth than any oath. "I ain't leaving you." The child, half asleep again, mumbled a soft sound that might have been relief, might have been trust made whole. The mother brushed her hair back and let her gaze rest on the man who had stood between her and the storm. For the first time she did not feel like a burden, but like someone worth saving. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the tracks from the earth, leaving only silence behind. Inside, the three of them sat in the fragile circle of light, bound not by blood or duty, but by a choice freely made. The fire cracked, steady against the night, and the world beyond their walls seemed, for a little while, unable to touch them. Some truths linger long after the storm has passed. In the quiet voice of the narrator, it remained like an echo carried down the years. Sometimes the West takes everything, and sometimes it gives back, if only to those who refuse to walk away.